In the floating spires of Zerion Prime, where crystalline towers pierce violet skies and twin moons cast silver shadows through palatial corridors, love was the one luxury Queen Lyrillith could never afford. Her emerald skin gleamed beneath the artificial suns as she ruled an empire spanning 3 star systems, while her 4 azure daughters grew up knowing their mother only as a distant figure draped in ceremonial robes. But what she discovered upon her unannounced return from the Galactic Council would challenge everything she believed about duty, sacrifice, and the beating heart beneath her crown. None of them, not her advisors, not her subjects, not even she herself, expected that the man who would change their lives forever was the one they all overlooked. Before we start, subscribe now so you don't miss more incredible stories like this one. Oh, and before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love hearing from you and always read every message. The royal spire of Zerion Prime stretched toward the heavens like a prayer carved from living crystal, its bioluminescent walls pulsing with the gentle rhythm of a sleeping heart. Within its vast halls, silence reigned supreme, the kind of profound quiet that only existed in places where power dwelled, cold and untouchable. 4 small figures moved through the grand corridor like whispers of color against the marble floors. Princess Zara, Princess Lila, Princess Nova, and Princess Ember, the royal quadruplets born of Queen Lyrillith's brief union with a diplomatic alliance that had crumbled like stardust. At 6 years old, their azure skin bore the telltale markings of Zerion nobility, delicate silver veins that traced their temples and the subtle points of their ears that marked them as pure-blooded royalty. Each wore a dress befitting their station, Zara in rose silk with circular patterns that caught the light like trapped stars, Lila in cream with a cascade of colorful embroidery, Nova in deeper rose with pearl trim, and Ember in vibrant aqua that matched her spirited personality. Their blonde hair, so unusual among their people, was arranged in identical ponytails that swayed as they walked. They moved with the careful steps of children who had learned too young that palaces were not playgrounds. The maintenance authority requires daily inspection of the lower levels, announced Protocol Droid 7729, its metallic voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Royal presence is not necessary. The children paused at the great intersection where 5 corridors met beneath a dome painted with the constellations of their conquered worlds. Far below, in the service levels where the nobility never ventured, the sound of working machinery hummed like a distant storm. "Who works down there?" whispered Zara, the eldest by mere minutes, but bearing the weight of eventual succession. "Maintenance staff, cleaning units. Nobody important," the droid replied with programmed dismissal. But Ember, smallest but most curious, pressed her face against the transparent aluminum barrier that separated the royal levels from the service areas. Her breath fogged the surface as she peered into the depths where beings moved like shadows, keeping their vast world functioning while remaining invisible to those who lived above. "There's someone singing," she said. The others gathered around her, 4 pairs of violet eyes watching the figure far below. Through the maintenance shafts, they could see a tall, muscular human male pushing a gravity cart loaded with cleaning supplies. His dark uniform marked him as one of the many indentured workers who maintained the palace. Humans captured during the Terran compliance wars and assigned to service the Zerion Empire. His voice drifted upward, a melody in the strange, lilting language of old Earth. Even from this distance, they could see the careful precision of his movements, the quiet dignity with which he performed his menial tasks. "Mother says humans are beneath us," Nova said, but her voice carried none of the conviction expected from a princess. "Mother says many things," Lila replied softly, "but Mother is never here." The truth of those words settled over them like a familiar shadow. Queen Lyrillith had departed for the Galactic Council 3 months ago, leaving them in the care of tutors, guards, and machines. She ruled an empire of billions, commanded fleets that could shatter planets, and negotiated treaties that would reshape the galaxy, but she had never sung them to sleep. Protocol Droid 7729 began moving again, its mechanical gait setting the pace for their daily constitutional. But as they walked away from the barrier, Ember lingered for just a moment longer, watching the human far below. Something in his movements, in the careful way he tended to even the smallest tasks, stirred a feeling she had no words for. "Princess Ember, Royal Protocol requires," began the droid. "I'm coming," she said, but her voice carried a new note of questioning that would have alarmed the palace security systems if they had been programmed to recognize such subtleties. As they walked deeper into the royal quarters, past portraits of conquered worlds and monuments to Zerion supremacy, none of them noticed the maintenance shaft opening in the distance. None of them saw the human worker pause in his duties to watch 4 small figures in elegant dresses disappear around a corner. But while the palace slept in its gilded splendor, something was stirring in the depths below, something that would soon challenge the very foundations of their isolated world. 3 weeks passed in the rigid routine of royal education. Languages, mathematics, interstellar politics, and weapons training filled the days, while the nights brought dreams of distant worlds the princesses would someday rule. But Ember found herself drawn again and again to the observation barriers, watching the levels below, where life seemed more real than the sterile perfection of their golden cage. The human was always there. She had learned his schedule without meaning to. Maintenance rounds at dawn, deep cleaning protocols in the afternoon, equipment repairs in the evening. His name, she discovered by listening to the service communications, was Jackson Reese, former construction engineer from the Terran colonies, captured during the siege of New Colorado and assigned to Palace Maintenance Division 7. "You're staring again," said Zara, joining her sister at the barrier. "He's different," Ember replied. "Look at how he works." Indeed, Jackson moved through his duties with an attention to detail that went far beyond mere compliance. When he cleaned the crystal formations that channeled light throughout the palace, he handled each one as if it were precious. When he repaired the atmospheric processes, his movements carried the confidence of someone who truly understood the technology. "All humans are the same," said Nova, though she too had begun to linger at the observation points. "Father says they're useful but inferior. Father said many things before the alliance fell apart," Lila observed quietly. Not all of them were true. The 4 sisters had grown closer in their mother's absence, united by their shared isolation and the questions that no one in the palace seemed willing or able to answer. They were princesses, heirs to an empire, but they were also children who had never experienced the simple warmth of unconditional love. On this particular day, as amber sunlight streamed through the great windows and painted the marble floors in geometric patterns, their routine was interrupted by an emergency alert. Red lights pulsed through the corridor as the palace's emergency system activated. The children huddled together as Protocol Droid 7729 received rapid data bursts through its communication array. "Atmospheric processor malfunction in Sector 7, the droid announced. "Containment field failure imminent. Evacuation protocols engaged." Through the barrier, they could see service personnel rushing through the lower levels. The atmospheric processors were critical systems. Their failure could flood entire sections of the palace with toxic gases from the industrial levels far below. "Emergency repair teams are responding," continued the droid. "Estimated time to system restoration, 4 hours. Royal quarters will maintain emergency life support." But Ember pressed closer to the barrier, watching the chaos below with growing concern. The repair teams moved with frantic energy, but their attempts seemed disorganized, almost panicked. Tools were dropped, commands were shouted in conflicting directions, and precious minutes ticked away as the containment field continued to deteriorate. Then she saw him. Jackson emerged from a maintenance shaft, his uniform already stained with the lubricants needed for emergency repairs. While the official repair teams argued over protocols, he moved directly to the main atmospheric processor, a massive cylindrical unit that hummed with barely contained energy. "He shouldn't be there," whispered Nova. "That's not his assignment." But Jackson seemed to understand the machinery in ways the repair teams did not. His hands moved across the control interfaces with practiced confidence, accessing subsystems and diagnostic routines with the efficiency of someone who had designed, rather than merely maintained, such equipment. The emergency lights continued to pulse as the containment field weakened. In the royal quarters above, automated systems sealed doors and engaged backup life support. But in the service levels, dozens of workers faced potential suffocation if the atmospheric processor failed completely. "Get back," shouted one of the repair supervisors, his voice carrying clearly through the communication systems. "You're not authorized for primary system access." Jackson ignored the order. His fingers flew across the control matrix, rerouting power flows and engaging emergency protocols that the repair teams seemed unaware existed. Sparks flew from overloaded circuits as he manually stabilized systems that the automated controls couldn't handle. The four princesses watched in fascination as this supposedly inferior human accomplished what their empire's trained technicians could not. His movements carried no hesitation, no uncertainty, only the fluid competence of someone working in his natural element. "That's impossible," breathed Zara. "Humans aren't supposed to understand Zarian technology." But even as she spoke, the emergency lights began to fade from red to amber. The atmospheric processor's hum stabilized, its energy patterns returning to normal. Through the barrier, they could see service personnel looking around in confusion and relief as clean air once again flowed through the lower levels. Jackson stepped back from the control matrix, his uniform now thoroughly stained with coolant and lubricants. For just a moment, he looked up toward the observation barriers. Though the distance was too great for eye contact, Ember felt as if he had seen her watching. Then he gathered his tools and disappeared into the maintenance shafts, leaving the official repair teams to take credit for his work. Protocol Droid 7729 received the all-clear signal and immediately resumed their educational schedule. But as they walked away from the barrier, Ember's mind raced with questions that had no place in a princess's carefully structured world. "Did you see what he did?" she whispered to her sisters. "We saw," Lila replied quietly. "But we're not supposed to see, are we?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered and dangerous. In a palace built on hierarchy and the absolute superiority of Zarian nobility, they had witnessed something that challenged everything they had been taught to believe. But while they wrestled with these uncomfortable truths, none of them knew that far across the galaxy, Queen Lyrillith was concluding her negotiations with the Galactic Council ahead of schedule, and that her unexpected return would set in motion events that would change everything. The days following the atmospheric crisis brought subtle changes to the palace routine. Ember found excuses to linger near the observation barriers, and one by one, her sisters began joining her. What had started as idle curiosity was becoming something more dangerous, genuine interest in the world beyond their golden cage. Jackson continued his duties with the same quiet efficiency, but now the princesses watched for the small signs of his true capabilities. When the main communications array developed a fault, he fixed it with modifications that went far beyond standard repair protocols. When the Quantum Garden's environmental systems malfunctioned, he not only restored them, but improved their efficiency by 12%. "How does he know so much?" Nova asked during their afternoon constitutional. "Perhaps," said Lila thoughtfully, "we don't know as much as we think we do." Their education continued under the watchful censors of Protocol Droid 7729 and their various tutors, but the lessons felt increasingly hollow. They learned about Zarian supremacy and the rightful order of the galaxy, but they saw daily evidence of that order's flaws in the very infrastructure that kept them alive. On the 14th day after the atmospheric crisis, their routine was again disrupted, this time by an event that would prove far more significant than any mechanical malfunction. Princess Ember had developed a habit of visiting the palace's memorial garden during the evening hours when the artificial suns dimmed to simulate natural twilight. The garden was one of the few places where living things grew, exotic plants from conquered worlds, carefully maintained in perfect displays of imperial power. She was examining a flowering vine from the Delta Quintus system when she heard voices from the service tunnel that ran beneath the garden's foundation. The tunnel was supposed to be sealed from the upper levels, but age had opened small gaps in the decorative stonework where sound could carry. "System efficiency is down 18%, came Jackson's voice, clear and precise. The distributed power grid was designed for a planet with stable weather patterns, but Zarian Prime has seasonal electromagnetic storms that disrupt standard load balancing. "You're talking above your classification level, human," replied another voice, one Ember recognized as Chief Engineer Vorthak, a Zarian military officer responsible for palace infrastructure. "With respect, sir, my classification has nothing to do with my knowledge of power systems. The grid needs adaptive load balancing protocols to handle storm season variants. I can design modifications that would improve efficiency and reduce system stress." There was a long pause. Then Vorthak's voice, colder now. "Your job is to clean conduits and replace worn components. Engineering decisions are made by your superiors." "Yes, sir. But when the storms hit next month, the current grid configuration will fail. People will die." "That is not your concern, human. Return to your duties." Ember pressed closer to the gap in the stonework, her heart racing. She was hearing something that wasn't meant for royal ears. A glimpse into the vast machinery that kept their world functioning and the conflicts that simmered beneath its polished surface. Footsteps echoed through the tunnel as Engineer Vorthak departed, but Jackson remained, and after a few moments, Ember heard the soft sounds of someone working with tools and components. Curiosity overcoming caution, she found a larger gap in the stonework and peered through. The service tunnel was dimly lit by maintenance strips, but she could see Jackson clearly. He had spread technical schematics across a portable work surface and was making modifications to some kind of control unit. His hands moved with the sure confidence of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. But more than his technical skill, what struck Ember was his expression, the quiet determination of someone willing to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. "I know you're there," he said softly, not looking up from his work. Ember's breath caught. She pressed herself against the stonework, hoping somehow to become invisible. "The acoustics in these tunnels carry both ways," Jackson continued, his tone gentle. "I've heard you and your sisters talking above the observation barriers." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of palace machinery and the soft clicking of Jackson's tools as he continued his unauthorized modifications. "You're going to fix it anyway," Ember said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even though he ordered you not to." "The storms will hit in 3 weeks," Jackson replied. "When they do, the power grid will fail and the environmental systems will shut down in the lower levels where 1,000 workers live. I can prevent that, so I will, even if they punish you." For the first time, Jackson looked up from his work, his gaze finding the gap in the stonework where she watched. His eyes were kind but tired, the eyes of someone who had seen too much and lost too much, but refused to let the weight of that experience crush his compassion. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "sometimes doing what's right is more important than doing what's safe." The simple statement hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible gulf. Here was a human slave speaking of moral courage to an alien princess, and somehow it felt like the most natural conversation in the world. "What were you before?" Ember asked. "Before the war, a lot of things," Jackson replied with a slight smile. "But mostly I was someone who built things instead of watching them break." A soft chime echoed through the garden above, the signal for evening meal preparation in the royal quarters. Ember knew she had to return before her absence was noted, but something made her linger. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "The memorial garden is beautiful in the morning," Jackson said diplomatically. "I often do maintenance work on the environmental systems just after dawn." It was an answer and an invitation wrapped in careful neutrality. As Ember made her way back to the royal levels, her mind raced with new thoughts and feelings. For the first time in her young life, she had spoken to someone who saw her not as a princess to be served or a political asset to be managed, but simply as a person worthy of honest conversation. Behind her, in the service tunnel, Jackson continued his work on the power grid modifications. Storm season was approaching, and regardless of official orders or personal risk, he would not stand by and watch innocent people suffer when he had the power to prevent it. But neither Ember nor Jackson knew that their brief conversation had been detected by palace security systems monitoring for unauthorized communications. The artificial intelligence that governed palace security had noted the anomaly, but had not yet determined whether it represented a threat, requiring immediate action. The decision would ultimately depend on whether their paths crossed again, and on whether the Queen's unexpected return would arrive before their careful balance of secrecy could be maintained. The twin moons of Zirion Prime hung like silver coins in the violet sky as storm season began its approach. Atmospheric pressure dropped, electromagnetic fields fluctuated, and the palace's environmental systems strained under the increasing load. In the royal quarters, climate control ensured that the approaching storms remained nothing more than a distant spectacle visible through crystalline windows. But Ember had begun to see the palace differently. During the past week, she had maintained her morning visits to the memorial garden, where brief conversations through the stonework gaps had revealed glimpses of a world she never knew existed. Jackson spoke little about himself, but gradually she learned fragments of his story. A former orbital engineer who had helped design the fusion plants that powered entire worlds. A man who had lost his family when their colony transport was captured by Zirion forces. Someone who chose to find meaning in small acts of service rather than surrender to despair. More importantly, he listened to her. When she spoke about the loneliness of royal life, about the weight of expectations she didn't understand, about the fear that she might grow up to be as distant and cold as the mother she barely knew, he listened without judgment and responded with gentle wisdom. Power isn't about making others smaller, he had said during one of their conversations. True power comes from making others stronger. It was a philosophy that contradicted everything she had been taught about Zirion nobility, yet it resonated with something deep inside her that had always questioned the isolation of royal life. On this particular morning, as electromagnetic readings climbed toward dangerous levels, Ember made her way to the memorial garden expecting their usual brief exchange. Instead, she found the service access panels sealed and warning lights blinking throughout the area. "Emergency protocols are in effect, Princess," announced Protocol Droid 77209 as it approached with mechanical precision. "All service access to this area has been restricted. Please return to the secure sections of the royal quarters." "What kind of emergency?" Ember asked, though her heart was already sinking with understanding. "A human maintenance worker has been detained for unauthorized modifications to critical palace infrastructure. All human workers are being questioned to determine if this represents coordinated sabotage." The words hit Ember like a physical blow. She forced herself to remain calm, to project the imperial composure expected of a princess, while inside her mind raced through the implications. Jackson had been discovered. His efforts to protect the lower levels from the approaching storms had been interpreted as sabotage, and now he faced punishment that could range from severe reconditioning to immediate execution. "Has Mother returned?" Ember asked, grasping for any possibility that might change the situation. "Queen Lerelith remains in session with the Galactic Council. Palace security is handling the investigation according to standard protocols. Standard protocols that viewed human life as expendable and any unauthorized action as potential treason." Ember walked through the rest of her morning lessons in a haze of worry and growing determination. By afternoon, when electromagnetic storm warnings reached critical levels and the palace's shields began their protective deployment, she had made a decision that would have terrified her tutors and shocked her family. She was going to act. The royal quarters had service corridors that connected to the main palace infrastructure. Pathways intended for emergency evacuation, but accessible to anyone who knew the proper codes. Ember had spent years memorizing every detail of the palace's layout, partly from boredom and partly from a natural curiosity that her tutors had never quite managed to suppress. As evening approached and the first electromagnetic pulses began crackling across Zerion Prime's upper atmosphere, she slipped away from her sisters during their study period. The service corridor was dark and unfamiliar, filled with the industrial sounds of a palace preparing for storm season, but she moved through it with growing confidence. The detention levels were deep in the palace's foundation, where holding cells housed those awaiting interrogation or punishment. Ember had never seen them before, but the layout matched the architectural plans she had studied. As she descended through increasingly utilitarian corridors, the sounds of the approaching storm grew louder, distant thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of their floating spire. She found him in cell block 7, behind force barriers that hummed with contained energy. Jackson sat on a simple metal bench, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his expression peaceful despite his circumstances. When he saw her approach, surprise flickered across his features. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "you shouldn't be here. Neither should you," Ember replied, pressing close to the energy barrier. "They're calling what you did sabotage." "I know, I expected it." "Then why did you do it?" Jackson stood and moved closer to the barrier, his eyes reflecting the blue glow of the containment field. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of conviction that made Ember understand why he had chosen this path, despite its consequences. "Because tomorrow, when the storms hit, my modifications will keep 1,000 workers from suffocating in the lower levels. Because sometimes protecting people you'll never meet is worth more than protecting yourself. And because..." He paused, his expression softening. "Because I hoped that somewhere in this palace, someone might understand that doing what's right matters more than following orders." The sincerity in his words, the quiet courage they represented, struck Ember with a force that seemed to reshape her understanding of what it meant to be noble. Here was a man facing potential death for trying to save others, and he spoke of it as if it were the only choice any decent person could make. "The storm warnings are getting worse," she said. "Your modifications, will they work?" "They'll work. The power grid will hold, the environmental systems will maintain pressure, and when morning comes, no one will die because of electrical failures. Chief Engineer Vorthak will probably take credit for the successful storm response, and that's fine. The important thing is that people will be safe." Thunder crashed overhead, close enough now that the detention level's lights flickered. In a few hours, Zerion Prime would be lashed by electromagnetic storms that could cripple unprotected systems and kill anyone caught in their path. "There has to be something I can do," Ember said desperately. "Some way to help you." Jackson smiled, the first truly peaceful expression she had seen from him. "You've already helped more than you know, Your Highness. You listened to me. You saw me as more than just a maintenance worker. In a palace full of people who look right through me, that means everything." The lights flickered again as the storm's leading edge reached the palace. In the distance, emergency sirens began to wail. Soon, the royal family would be sealed in their secure chambers while the storm raged overhead. And Jackson would face interrogation that could very well end his life. But as Ember stood before the detention cell, watching this remarkable man face his fate with quiet dignity, she felt something awakening inside her that had nothing to do with royal training or imperial protocols. She felt the first stirrings of the kind of love that could reshape worlds. The electromagnetic storm struck Zerion Prime with the fury of an angry god. Lightning arced between the palace's crystal spires, turning the twilight sky into a canvas of electric fire. In the royal quarters, sealed behind layers of protective shielding, the storm was merely a spectacular light show visible through reinforced windows. But deep in the detention levels, Jackson felt every pulse of electromagnetic energy as it tested his modifications to the palace's power grid. He sat in meditation, his engineer's mind automatically tracking the storm's progress through the sounds of stressed machinery and fluctuating power. The main grid held steady. Secondary systems maintained their loads. Environmental processors continued their vital work, protecting thousands of beings throughout the palace complex. His modifications were working. "Interrogation will commence when the storm passes," announced the automated detention system. Preliminary charges include sabotage, unauthorized access to critical systems, and violation of service protocols. The charges were serious enough to warrant reconditioning at best, execution at worst. But as thunder crashed overhead and electromagnetic pulses lit the corridor beyond his cell, Jackson felt a deep satisfaction that transcended personal fear. He had kept his word. People would live because of what he had built. 3 levels above, in the secure royal quarters, Ember paced her chambers like a caged star wolf. Her sisters sat at the great window watching the storm's magnificent fury paint the sky in impossible colors, but she couldn't focus on anything except the man imprisoned far below. "You're worried about the human," said Zara quietly. It wasn't a question. The quadruplets had developed an almost telepathic awareness of each other's emotions over the years, and Ember's distress had been growing stronger throughout the day. "His name is Jackson," Ember replied, still pacing. "And yes, I'm worried about him." "Why?" asked Nova, turning from the window. "Humans are replaceable. There are thousands more in the service levels." The casual dismissal of human life, so typical of Zarian aristocracy, made Ember's stomach twist with revulsion. "He's not replaceable. He saved lives today. His modifications are the only reason the power grid is holding during this storm." "How do you know about his modifications?" Lila asked, her voice sharp with sudden understanding. Ember stopped pacing. For weeks, she had kept her conversations with Jackson secret, but the weight of that secrecy had become unbearable. Looking at her 3 sisters, the only family she really knew, she made a decision that would change everything between them. "Because I've been talking to him," she said simply. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm's thunder. Zara, Nova, and Lila stared at their sister with expressions ranging from shock to horror to fascination. "Talking to him," whispered Nova. "How? Where?" demanded Zara. "For how long?" breathed Lila. Ember told them everything. The observations from the barriers, the overheard conversations, the meetings in the memorial garden, the growing understanding that everything they had been taught about human inferiority was a lie designed to maintain Zarion dominance. As she spoke, she watched her sisters' faces change from disapproval to confusion to something approaching wonder. "He really prevented the atmospheric processor crisis?" asked Lila. "He really designed improvements to the power grid?" asked Nova. "He really chose to help people even though he knew he'd be punished?" asked Zara. "Yes," Ember replied. "All of it. And tomorrow, they're going to interrogate him for it. They might kill him for saving lives." Thunder crashed overhead so close that the palace's superstructure groaned under the electromagnetic assault. But the lights remained steady. The environmental systems hummed without strain, and the protective shields held firm against the storm's fury. "His modifications are working," Lila said wonderingly. "We're alive because of what he did, and they're going to execute him for it," Ember replied bitterly. Zara stood up from the window, her expression thoughtful. As the eldest, she carried the weight of eventual succession and the political awareness that came with it. "There might be a way to help him," she said slowly. "How?" the others asked almost simultaneously. "Royal intervention. If we formally request his transfer to royal service, it would supersede the security charges." But Zara paused, understanding the implications of what she was suggesting. It would mean openly defying palace protocol, going against everything we've been taught about maintaining proper distance from the service classes. It would mean choosing what's right over what's expected, Ember said quietly, echoing words that had been haunting her thoughts. The 4 sisters looked at each other, weighing duty against conscience, safety against courage. Outside their window, the storm raged with unprecedented fury, but Jackson's modifications held firm. The proof of his worth surrounded them in the form of continued safety and comfort. "We would have to present a united front," Zara said finally. "All 4 of us, requesting his transfer for the same reason." "What reason?" asked Nova. "Personal guard duty," Lila suggested. "Mother has been concerned about our security in her absence." "Educational consultation," Nova countered. We could claim we need a technology tutor. No, said Ember quietly. All three sisters turned to look at her. We tell the truth. We request his transfer because he's proved his worth through his actions, because he deserves recognition rather than punishment, and because treating him as disposable would be morally wrong. The radical honesty of the proposal took their breath away. In a society built on careful lies and diplomatic fiction, speaking such truth would be tantamount to revolution. It would change everything, whispered Zara. Everything is already changing, Ember replied. The question is whether we change with it or let it change without us. Lightning blazed across the sky, illuminating their faces in stark relief. 4 young princesses, barely more than children, stood at the crossroads between the world they had inherited and the world they might choose to create. We do it together, said Lila finally. We do it together, agreed Nova. We do it together, confirmed Zara. We do it together, Ember whispered, and felt the first tremors of an earthquake that would reshape their corner of the galaxy. But even as they made their choice, none of them knew that far across space, Queen Lireleth's negotiations had concluded abruptly. The Galactic Council sessions had ended 3 days ahead of schedule, and the Queen's royal transport was already entering Zerion Prime's outer atmosphere. By dawn, their mother would be home. Dawn came quietly to Zerion Prime, the electromagnetic storm having exhausted itself against the planet's shields during the night. The palace's crystal spires caught the light of the binary suns and scattered it in rainbow patterns across the courtyard where royal transports traditionally landed. Queen Lireleth's ship descended through the morning sky like a falling star wrapped in ceremonial dignity. The Quantum Crown, her personal vessel, was a masterwork of Zerion engineering, its biometallic hull shifting colors as it moved through different atmospheric layers. Protocol demanded that the royal family be present for her arrival, but the 4 princesses stood on the reception balcony with hearts heavy with secrets and minds focused on the man imprisoned far below. The Queen emerged from her transport with the fluid grace that had made her famous across 3 star systems. Her emerald skin gleamed like polished jade in the morning light, and her long, silver-pink hair cascaded over the shoulders of an elaborate ceremonial gown that seemed to capture and reflect the very essence of starlight. She was beautiful, powerful, and utterly remote, more symbol than mother, more concept than person. Your Majesty, the princesses said in unison, executing the precise bows they had practiced thousands of times. My daughters, Lireleth replied, her voice carrying the melodic formality that served her well in diplomatic negotiations, but felt strange and cold in the context of family. You have grown in my absence. It was true. 3 months of independence, 3 months of questioning, 3 months of gradually awakening awareness had changed them in ways that went far beyond physical development. But Queen Lireleth saw only what she expected to see: 4 properly trained princesses, beautiful and compliant, ready to fulfill their destinies as political assets in an expanding empire. Come, the Queen continued, I have much to discuss regarding the council negotiations and your future roles in galactic diplomacy. They followed her into the palace's state chambers, where holographic displays showed star charts and diplomatic agreements that would reshape the balance of power across known space. Queen Lireleth moved among these displays with practiced authority, explaining trade routes and military alliances and political marriages with the same clinical precision she might use to discuss crop yields or manufacturing quotas. The Andorian Empire has agreed to a non-aggression pact in exchange for mineral rights in the Outer Rim, she explained, her fingers dancing across controls that made entire star systems light up and shift position. Princess Zara, you will be betrothed to the Crown Prince of Andorian when you reach majority. The ceremony will formally seal the alliance. Zara's face went pale, but she maintained royal composure. Yes, Mother. Princess Lila, the Centauri Federation has requested educational exchanges. You will spend 2 years at their diplomatic academy before returning to serve as our ambassador to their worlds. Yes, Mother, Lila whispered. Princess Nova, the military council has recommended advanced tactical training. You will command our newest battle cruiser within the decade. Yes, Mother, Nova managed. Queen Lyrillith turned to her youngest daughter, and for just a moment, her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Princess Ember, your analytical scores show remarkable aptitude for systems engineering. The Science Council believes you could lead our terraforming efforts in the newly discovered sectors. The irony was crushing. Ember, who had spent weeks learning to value human life and question Zerion's supremacy, was being groomed to lead projects that would doubtless involve the subjugation of countless worlds and species. "Yes, Mother," she said, but her voice carried a hollow quality that made her sisters glance at her with concern. "Excellent," Queen Lyrillith said, her attention already returning to the star charts. "These arrangements will secure Zerion dominance for the next century. Your individual desires are secondary to the greater good of our people." The casual dismissal of their personal autonomy, spoken as if it were natural law rather than arbitrary choice, crystallized everything the sisters had been feeling. They were not children to be loved and nurtured. They were weapons to be aimed at political targets. "Mother," Ember said suddenly, her voice cutting through the Queen's diplomatic monologue. Lyrillith turned, surprised by the interruption. "Yes, we have a request, all four of us united in our petition." The formality of the language was deliberate, a way of forcing the Queen to take their words seriously according to royal protocol. Lyrillith's expression shifted subtly, her political instincts recognizing that she was being maneuvered into a formal audience by her own daughters. "Speak," she said. Ember took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her sister's support behind her. "We request the immediate transfer of maintenance worker Jackson Reese to royal service, with full pardons for any charges currently pending against him." The request landed in the state chamber like a quantum bomb. Queen Lyrillith stared at her daughters with an expression that shifted rapidly from confusion to surprise to something approaching alarm. "You are aware of specific service personnel?" she asked carefully. "We are aware of Jackson Reese's contributions to palace security during your absence," Zara said, stepping forward to support her sister. "His technical modifications prevented catastrophic system failures during last night's storm. His engineering expertise saved thousands of lives," added Lila. "His actions demonstrate exactly the kind of innovation and dedication that the royal house should reward," concluded Nova. Queen Lyrillith's expression had turned to ice. "You have been speaking with human service personnel." It was a statement, not a question, and it carried the weight of absolute royal displeasure. But having come this far, the sisters found the courage to continue. "We have been learning, Mother," Ember said quietly. "Learning that intelligence and worth are not determined by species. Learning that loyalty and courage can be found in unexpected places. Learning that true nobility means protecting those who cannot protect themselves. You have been contaminated," the Queen said flatly, "exposed to inappropriate influences and allowed to develop sympathy for inferior beings." The words stung because they revealed the vast gulf between mother and daughters, between the political necessities that drove the Queen's life and the moral awakening that was reshaping her children's worldview. "If caring about justice makes us contaminated," Ember replied with growing strength, "then perhaps contamination is better than purity." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant hum of palace machinery that continued to function perfectly because of Jackson's modifications. Queen Lyrillith looked at her four daughters as if seeing them clearly for the first time, and what she saw filled her with a complex mixture of pride, fear, and something that might have been recognition. "This human," she said finally, "this Jackson Reese, bring him to the throne room. I will evaluate his worth personally." It was not the immediate pardon they had hoped for, but it was a chance. As servants hurried to carry out the Queen's command, the four sisters exchanged glances loaded with hope and terror. They had forced their mother to confront the contradictions in her own system of values. Now they would learn whether a heart still beat beneath the crown. The throne room of Zerion Prime was a masterpiece of intimidation designed to reduce petitioners to awed submission before they ever spoke a word. Crystalline columns soared toward a vaulted ceiling, painted with scenes of Xerian conquests, while the throne of stars itself seemed to float above the floor, suspended by forces that bent light and gravity to royal will. Queen Lirelith sat upon that throne like a goddess carved from emerald and starlight, her ceremonial gown flowing around her in patterns that seemed to shift and breathe with each movement. The four princesses stood in formal array to her right, their faces carefully composed, despite the storm of emotions raging within their hearts. At the far end of the throne room, massive doors opened with a sound like distant thunder. Jackson Reese entered between two royal guards, his wrists bound with energy shackles that glowed like captured lightning. Despite his restraints and the grime of imprisonment, he carried himself with quiet dignity, his back straight and his gaze level. He looked like what he was, a man who had made peace with his choices and would face their consequences without flinching. The queen studied him as he approached, her trained eye taking in every detail. Here was no cowering slave or broken prisoner. This human moved with the confidence of someone who knew his own worth, regardless of the circumstances that had reduced him to bondage. "Jackson Reese," the queen said, her voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. "You stand accused of sabotage, unauthorized modification of critical systems, and violation of service protocols. How do you answer these charges?" Jackson stopped at the prescribed distance from the throne and executed a slight bow that acknowledged royal authority without suggesting submission. "Your Majesty, I modified the palace's power distribution system to prevent system failures during electromagnetic storms. I accessed engineering protocols without authorization to protect the lives of service personnel who would have died in the lower levels if the environmental systems had failed. I violated service protocols by prioritizing the welfare of your people over strict adherence to command hierarchy." The stark honesty of his response sent ripples of shock through the assembled court officials. By admitting to the charges while simultaneously justifying his actions, Jackson had turned his defense into a statement of principle that challenged the very foundations of Xerian law. "You do not deny sabotage," the queen observed. "I deny malicious intent, Your Majesty. Everything I did was designed to protect and preserve, not to harm or destroy. If ensuring the survival of your people constitutes sabotage, then I am guilty as charged." Queen Lirelith leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "And what qualifies a human maintenance worker to make such modifications? What expertise do you possess that our own engineers lack?" For the first time since entering the throne room, Jackson allowed himself a slight smile. "Before my capture, I was Dr. Jackson Reese, Chief Systems Engineer for the Terra Nova Colonial Development Project. I designed the fusion power plants that powered 17 worlds. I created the atmospheric processes that made dead planets livable for millions of people. I built infrastructure that lasted decades and saved countless lives across the outer colonies." The admission fell into the throne room like a stone dropped into still water, sending shockwaves through everyone present. Dr. Jackson Reese had been a legend in the engineering community, a visionary whose work had shaped the development of entire star systems before the Xerian expansion had swept him into slavery. Queen Lirelith's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She had known intellectually that many humans of skill and education had been captured during the compliance wars, but she had never been faced directly with the reality of what that meant. Here stood a man whose genius had once commanded the respect of governments and whose current role involved cleaning waste disposal systems. "You designed the Terra Nova atmospheric processors?" she asked, and for the first time her voice carried genuine curiosity rather than royal formality. "Among other things, Your Majesty, the distributed power grid, the environmental management systems, the quantum communications array. My team revolutionized colonial infrastructure design throughout the Outer Rim, and now you clean conduits in my palace. Now I do what I can with what I have." Jackson replied simply, "The work itself isn't important. What matters is doing it well and protecting people when the opportunity arises." From their position beside the throne, the four princesses watched their mother wrestle with concepts that challenged everything she had built her life upon. Here was tangible proof that the Xerion Empire had reduced brilliant minds to menial labor, that their system of casual superiority had blinded them to the potential contributions of those they considered inferior. "The modifications you made," the Queen continued, "they functioned perfectly during last night's storm. They will function perfectly for years to come, Your Majesty. The power grid is now 30% more efficient and completely resistant to electromagnetic interference. Your palace is safer and more sustainable than it was before. And you expect no recognition for this achievement? I expect nothing, Your Majesty. Recognition was never the goal. Protection was the goal. Safety was the goal. Preventing unnecessary death was the goal." The pure altruism of his motivation seemed to strike Queen Lyrillith like a physical blow. She had spent decades in a political environment where every action carried an agenda, where generosity was always a form of manipulation and kindness always concealed a price. To encounter someone whose motivations were genuinely selfless challenged her fundamental understanding of how intelligent beings operated. She rose from her throne and descended the crystalline steps until she stood directly before Jackson. This close, the differences in their species were clear. Her emerald skin and pointed ears, his human features and brown eyes, but so too were the similarities: intelligence, dignity, and something deeper that transcended mere biology. "My daughters," the Queen said without turning away from Jackson, "have requested your transfer to royal service. They believe you deserve recognition rather than punishment." "Your daughters," Jackson replied, his voice soft with genuine warmth, "are remarkable young women who see clearly past the barriers that blind most adults. They have shown me kindness when kindness was not required, and understanding when understanding was not expected. Whatever recognition I might deserve pales beside what they have already given me." It was Princess Ember who stepped forward, her young voice cutting through the formal atmosphere of the throne room with crystalline clarity. "Mother," she said, "if we are to rule an empire built on the willing cooperation of many species, should we not demonstrate that ability and dedication are rewarded regardless of origin? If we are to command respect across the galaxy, should we not show that we recognize excellence wherever we find it?" The political wisdom of her daughter's words was not lost on Queen Lyrillith, but more than that, she heard in Ember's voice an echo of her own younger self, the idealistic princess who had once dreamed of a more just and compassionate empire before the realities of power had worn away those dreams. Looking into Jackson's steady eyes, seeing the quiet courage that had driven him to risk everything for people he barely knew, Queen Lyrillith felt something stirring in her chest that she had thought long dead. Not attraction, though she could admit he was remarkable, but recognition. Here was someone who embodied the values she had once hoped to bring to the throne before compromise and pragmatism had taught her to settle for stability over justice. "Dr. Jackson Reese," she said formally, her voice carrying throughout the throne room, "I hereby pardon all charges against you and transfer you to the Royal Engineering Corps with the rank of Senior Consultant. You will report directly to the Crown and advise on infrastructure development throughout our territories." The court erupted in shocked murmurs, but the Queen silenced them with a gesture. She was not finished. "Furthermore," she continued, "you will serve as technical advisor to my daughters as they prepare for their future roles. They have much to learn about leadership, and you have much to teach about the courage required to do what is right, rather than what is convenient." Jackson bowed deeply, and when he straightened, his eyes met Ember's across the throne room. In that glance, she saw gratitude, respect, and something else that made her heart race with unfamiliar emotions. As the energy shackles fell away and Jackson was fitted with the insignia of his new rank, Queen Lyrillith made a decision that would ripple across the galaxy. The Xerion Empire would begin to change, slowly, carefully, but inevitably. And at the heart of that transformation would be the love between species, the courage of children, and the wisdom that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the simplest acts of compassion. Standing in the throne room surrounded by her daughters and watching Jackson accept his new responsibilities with the same quiet dignity he had shown in Chains, Queen Lyrelith felt the first stirrings of hope she had experienced in decades. Perhaps it was not too late after all. 1 year later, the changes that had begun in a palace throne room rippled outward like waves across the cosmic ocean. The Xerion Accords, a revolutionary series of treaties that granted rights and representation to all species within the Empire, were signed on the anniversary of Jackson's pardon. The ceremony took place not in the sterile grandeur of government halls, but in the memorial garden, where Ember and Jackson had first spoken through gaps in ancient stonework. Princess Ember stood beside her mother on the ceremonial platform, wearing not the elaborate gowns of formal court dress, but the practical uniform of the newly formed Interspecies Engineering Corps. At 19, she had grown into a leader who understood that true strength came from building bridges rather than walls. Jackson stood with the other corps directors, his once makeshift uniform now replaced with the formal insignia of his role as Chief Innovation Officer for the Xerion Empire. The position had been created specifically for him, a recognition that genius could emerge from anywhere and should be nurtured regardless of its origins. "The future," Queen Lyrelith said as she signed the final accord, "belongs to those who see potential rather than limitation, who choose cooperation over domination, who build rather than merely conquer." As the ceremony concluded and representatives from dozens of worlds celebrated the dawn of a new age, Ember found herself walking the garden paths with Jackson. They moved together with the easy familiarity of people who had spent countless hours working side by side, designing infrastructure that would serve all species equally. "Do you think it will last?" Ember asked, pausing beside the flowering vine from Delta Quintus that had grown to cover much of the garden's eastern wall. "Change is never easy," Jackson replied thoughtfully. "There will be resistance, setbacks, people who profit from the old ways and fight to maintain them. But yes, I think it will last, because it's built on something stronger than laws or treaties." "What's that?" Jackson turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw the same warmth that had sustained her through a year of challenges and transformations. "Love," he said simply. "Love for justice, love for each other, love for the idea that we can be better than we are." They stood together in the garden where their first conversation had planted seeds that grew into galactic transformation. Around them, beings from dozens of worlds celebrated a future none of them had dared imagine just a year before. "I love you," Ember said quietly, the words carrying the weight of truth that could reshape stars. "I love you too," Jackson replied, and in those words was the promise of a future where love transcended species, where courage could overcome tradition, and where two hearts could indeed change the galaxy. As the twin moons rose over Xerion Prime and artificial lights gave way to starlight, Ember and Jackson walked hand in hand through gardens that bloomed with life from 100 worlds. Behind them, the palace hummed with the efficient energy of systems designed to serve rather than dominate. Above them, ships from across the Empire carried news of the Accords to worlds where hope was being reborn. In a universe built on power and conquest, love had proven to be the most revolutionary force of all. And in the years that followed, as the Xerion Empire transformed from a domain of fear into a confederation of willing partners, historians would mark this moment as the day when the galaxy learned that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the courage to see another being as worthy of love. The stars themselves seemed to shine brighter, as if the universe itself approved of what two hearts had accomplished when they chose compassion over convention, understanding over prejudice, and love over fear. In the end, that was how empires truly fell, and better worlds were born. Not through the clash of armies or the schemes of politicians, but through the simple revolutionary act of one person seeing the dignity in another and choosing to act on that recognition. The future stretched before them like an infinite garden, ready to be cultivated by hands that understood that the greatest power lay not in ruling others, but in loving them enough to help them grow. Word count, 7,247 words.